So I think we're going to hand over to Dominique now. So Dr. Dominique Thompson was a GP for students for many, many years, and now is really an expert in student mental health as well as younger people, teenagers' mental health, and has written again many, many books on this subject. I was so thrilled to chat with her recently. And I think we need to hear from her really kind of how our students are doing. We've all met some of them, but we'd like a bigger picture and some of the bigger picture concepts about the challenges that this current student generation is facing, pre-COVID and in COVID especially. So Dominique, I think we'll hand over to you and you can unmute and share your slides. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure, although I'm feeling slightly anxious about my liking for avocados. Sorry.
I love avocados.
Okay, so I am going to do the classic slide share screen thing, and hopefully you can now, I'm just looking for a nod from, yeah, great. Okay, right, off we go. So thank you so much, first of all, for inviting me to be with you. And can I just thank you actually for educating the next generation, because it is such an important role, but they particularly need lots of support, as you might be about to hear. So just very quickly, who am I? Who is this woman in front of you who likes avocados? I spent almost 20 years sitting in that chair. No, we didn't update it. I was a GP. I looked after students. I didn't, as you can imagine, have them sitting in with me because that would have been awkward when they saw their flatmates. So I was a university GP. I was head of a university practice for 7 of those years at the University of Bristol. And I spent day in, day out, as you can imagine, listening to students of all different ages, of course, but the vast majority sort of, 18 to 25, really, I suppose, and hearing what was going on for them. And the big thing that changed for me in that time was that when I first started, I would probably see 1 or 2 students a day out of, 30, 35, whatever was coming in 20 years ago, for a mental health problem. So 1 or 2 a day. And by the time I left clinical practice 3 years ago, it was 9 out of 10. So 9 out of 10 of all of my consultations day in, day out for mental health. Now, that's obviously at the higher end of the spectrum, and for the average across the UK in university practices, the figure is 50%. So 1 in 2 consultations is for mental health. In general practice, it's 1 in 3 according to the Royal College, and all of my references are at the end on a final slide if you do need them. So I felt that I was seeing a lot of mental health. I was seeing a lot of mental health, and I wanted to understand that better, and I wanted to understand why. And so that's kind of what I've done the last 3 years, is look into it, done a couple of TEDx talks, write books about it. Some books are for students. The little books at the top there are like little backpack guide books that you'd put in your backpack, and the book for parents, because if you're going to raise your kids in this world, they needed to hear what I was hearing in my consulting room. And I've written a chapter for the mental health and wellbeing book that's for staff, the green one there. So, and I've contributed to lots of stuff because I think it's so important that what I was hearing got back out to the people who needed to know about it. So first of all, what I'm going to do in this very quick talk is give you the quick context, like what's happening, and then I'm going to hopefully share a bit about why it's happening, and then some ideas about the COVID impact as well. And obviously I'm happy to take questions. And then I'm doing a workshop later, which is more in depth about medical students specifically, and what we can do to help them as well. But in the background, before any of 2020 happened, it's important to remember, sadly, that the kids were not all right, okay? They weren't doing just fine, and then COVID came along. They were struggling. We were seeing a rise in numbers, in demand, in complexity. So that means students coming to university now, they're just as likely perhaps to have anxiety, but they might also have PTSD or have suffered complex risk and abuse in their life at home. So the wonderful thing about opening up university means that lots more people get that opportunity of an education, but clearly we see much more complex and high risk young people. don't have to tell you that the NHS struggles to support them with being under-resourced for so long. So you have amazing people working in a system that is so badly underfunded that we can't get a CAMS, or in our case, a CMHT referral for love nor money. And, you know, people have to reach crisis again and again before they get the help they need. There was a rising interest from the media, as I no doubt you're aware. We're now talking about student mental health, which we never did 10 or 15 years ago. And then the carers and the parents and the students, they expect more of us now. So they're coming to uni and they expect to be supported, not unreasonably, that's what happens. And of course, any impact on young people, on children, on teenagers and young adults will have an impact in the workplace. That's, you know, just logic really. So there you have some headlines that we've had over the last few years, the most recent one from the BMJ 2020, and that's that we're seeing more suicidal thinking. So it's not changing, but we weren't really starting from a great position. And sadly, I'm afraid I'm going to have to tell you this as well. Our 15-year-olds in the UK are some of the unhappiest in the world. And this is not a statistic that I sort of say lightly. I think this is one of the saddest things that I sort of say in my talks. We have an issue. Something is going on in the UK that means that the most recent PISA study, and some of you maybe have heard of the PISA study, which is done every 3 years to look at academic achievement around the world, but it also looks at well-being, has shown that our 15-year-olds are really frightened of failure. They have a real fear of failure. They have low life satisfaction. And they also, the sort of lowest proportion around the world, pretty much, or lower than average, have a sense of purpose, a feeling that their life has meaning, and they're very anxious. And I've put Estonia and Finland there with the question really, should we be more Finland? Should we be more Estonia? Because they're clearly getting something right. And a whole other talk would be about what they're doing well. And it's a very interesting topic, and there's some great books about it, which I'm happy to share. But, you know, we have to think about what is going on now. One of the obvious things is that our 15-year-olds, unlike many other countries, are preparing for GCSEs. Okay, so an awful lot of education systems have no exams at that age. So that's just something to think about. What's going on? Okay, I always start with biology. I think that's fairly obvious. We're all GPs. And it's really important to remember the background risk of having a mental health problem in your life is that if you're going to have one, 3/4 of them are going to start before the age of 24. And I have to think about things in quite a sort of simple way. And I think of this as, you know, if you're building your brain, so you're building it from before you're born all the way through till about 25, that doesn't mean it starts melting at 25. It's just that it's considered fully adult in the late 20s. So if you're growing your brain, that is when the most likely time for something to go wrong is, when you're building it or when you're constructing things. So if you're going to have childhood trauma play out, or your genetics and something else combined, so nature and nurture, it's likely to happen before the age of 24. We know, of course, that 50% of them start before the age of 14, and that does encompass things that you are born with, so autism, ADHD, and so on. So really interesting, but important to remember, because that is also the age they come to uni. So if that is the case, okay, if basic genetics and biology have been around for millennia, that bit hasn't changed necessarily. Something else is going on. And I think this is what is absolutely fascinating to start to unpick and think about. I'm going to lay out a few of those things here. I do go more into detail in the various books, whether it's for the students or for the parents, so that if you're interested, there's more in there. But I think these are the things that are really key to just reflect on and think about how, you know, we're immersed in this, but because we're immersed in it, we don't always have time to think about it. One of the most fascinating things to have come out of research in the last 3 years is that the levels of perfectionism in the young generation have risen over the last 30 years. So very clever psychologists have looked at perfectionistic tendencies or traits over the last 30 years. And every year, 30 years, they've measured them in the same age group, in that 18 to sort of 24-year-olds each year. And what they've noticed is this huge rise in perfectionistic traits. Now, I think that's absolutely fascinating. We all have perfectionism to a greater or lesser degree. It's like kindness. It's a human trait. I think it's fair to say, I think Russell said it, I'm the more perfectionistic end. My husband, sadly, much less so, but he's also a GP, so there's room for everyone. But the point is that this perfectionism has risen, and that matters. Okay, it matters not because, oh well, they'll write a better essay with like more dotting of the I's and crossing of the T's, and they'll have a tidy desk. If only that was the simple thing. But what it is this toxic perfectionism where they are highly self-critical of themselves. So they are never happy with what they have achieved. If they get 95%, say, in something, they look for what happened to the 5%. They want to know what went wrong, and they're super sort of undermining of themselves. So they're never happy with what they achieve. And that kind of toxic perfectionism is associated with a rise in anxiety, in depression, in self-harm, in eating disorders, and sadly suicidal thinking. So perfectionism matters because of its association with mental health conditions. So you might be wondering, well, what's gone on over 30 years? Now, there are lots of theories, but one of the interesting ones is around the way that the world has become more competitive. So it's normal that, and we're used to, if you like, in our culture, that academia is competitive, work, sport, the singing and dancing type of stuff in life. We've often had that competitive. But what we've done is made fun competitive. So everything that was relaxing and fun in the past seems to have become increasingly competitive. So cooking, robot building, sculpture, painting, putting on your makeup. If you haven't seen Glow Up, check out what I'm talking about on BBC. And my least favourite one, the one that upsets me, is we've made cake competitive. And we have to think about the impact of being in that world for young people. They don't know any different. They don't remember a time before that. All the messages to them are that if you bake a cake, it has to be the best. It has to be competition winning standard. In fact, if you fall in love on an island, you have to win at being in love. It means that everything around them is super, super competitive. And that is a pressure that they live with all the time. And they're probably unaware of what they're experiencing because that is their norm. Then, of course, there's the parent involvement that has increased over the last 20 or so years. Not necessarily a bad thing, just saying that it does have an impact, which means that we have parents phoning universities in the way that they would phone the school. They speak to the tutor, they email them, even though the tutors are saying, I can't discuss things. These are adults we're talking about. I, as a GP, certainly had calls, for example, from a mum who said, Dr. Thompson, you have to stop him from gaming all night. Okay, I said, I'm not quite sure how I'm going to do that. I'm his GP. And also he's 23. You know, we have to think about what parents are expecting and the level of involvement. So just something to reflect on, but definitely a shift over the last 20 years or so of how we are involved. And as a parent and a step parent, I have 4 grown-up stepchildren and a 10-year-old. We have to think about how we influence our young people's lives and still allow them to be independent and make the decisions for themselves. Social media, really important. I think social media has amazing positives, but in this case, what I'm trying to say is that it magnifies this competitiveness, this perfectionism, the comparisons, the constant, am I better or worse? Have I got a like? And so on. So social media is fantastic in many ways, but we need to be aware that it magnifies these impacts. I probably don't have to tell you that world events are quite stressful at the moment, and that, you know, really does impact young people. They take this sort of thing extremely seriously. They are the most engaged generation in many ways that we've seen for a long time, whether that is Black Lives Matters or the environment and protecting the planet. When the Brexit vote happened, I remember I was sitting in clinic the next day, sobbing gently, but that's a different issue, and the students were coming in and they were all so upset. They take these things hugely seriously, and these impact on their mental health. And I just want to go back to that picture you can see there of the first class honours for a quarter of UK graduates. When people talk about competitiveness, it's really important to think about the fact that things have changed at university as well. When you went, or if you went to university in the 70s, you were 1 in 7 to go to university. You know, it was really quite unusual. And if, like me, you went in the 80s, very old now, you were 1 in 5. So only 20% of my class would have gone to uni, but now it's 1 in 2. Now, obviously in medicine, that means medicine is highly competitive, but actually just all the undergrads are 1 in 2, meaning that having a degree in itself sometimes feels like it's not enough, and they have to do better and get a first. So more of them are getting a first, and some argue that that's grade inflation as well, but actually I've seen them, they are burning out trying to get a first, trying to be the best, because they have to stand out, or they do a master's or a PhD because of the competitiveness of society. So from this slide, I guess, you know, my quick message here, and there's a lot to get across, but have a think about how you can help them in this world by sharing your failures. If things don't work out for you, let them know it's normal. If you don't get a paper published, or you don't get the job that you wanted, or your house falls through, or whatever, let them know that that's normal. Okay, we need to normalize that life doesn't always succeed for everybody. And the other thing is, I guess, and I do love a quiz, don't get me wrong on that, but just ask yourself in everyday life, what can you make less competitive? So if everyone's bringing cakes into work, don't make it a bake-off, just have cake. You know, just think about what you can do that makes the world a little bit less stressful for them. Okay, so we've talked about these kind of ingredients for a perfect storm. I'm going to speed on through COVID-19 because that's added an extra layer of difficulty for our young people, who all of these things are going on for them in their late teens, early 20s often, which is a time when their brain is still developing and very much susceptible to all these impacts. So the BMJ did a pretty brilliant, thorough review, but it looked at what the at-risk groups are likely to be. I've listed them now, I'm not going to go through them all, but what you'll note is healthcare, frontline workers and students are in that list of being particularly at risk of the mental health impact of COVID, for various reasons that range from, you know, not being necessarily able to do their placements and see, you know, the patients and do their training, through to the fact that they might have been at the front line seeing really difficult things and being with people when they died, you know, all of those things that are incredibly stressful. So your students that you're working with might fall into any of those categories. They might be, you know, bereaved, or have had COVID themselves, or had their own healthcare disrupted. They might have felt really quite isolated, obviously, but the additional layer of that, obviously, is being a healthcare student. So really important to bear in mind, there are lots and lots of things that might have adversely impacted their mental health. The things you might notice, just again, these are all from the studies done so far, are showing a change or an increase in these sorts of things. And some of them are obvious, of course, you know, bereavement and loss. Guilt, I think, is an interesting one. We might see people have either survivor guilt, or they might have the guilt that they weren't with someone when they died, or a family member, they couldn't see them and so on, or they might have the guilt that they couldn't do more. So there's some really interesting things that are likely to come out over the next few months, and certainly as we go into the second wave. Now, also to just be really flagging this up, we have seen studies that have shown addictions and alcohol and substance misuse have gone up, and there have been significant impacts on people's mental health. We know that eating disorders have got worse. it's from everything, as I said before, it's complicated, you know, they can't get the healthcare they need necessarily as easily, through to if there's panic buying of food, that makes people with eating disorders feel very stressed indeed. So, you know, we've seen all sorts of issues going on, and, you know, if you are an anxious person and you become fearful of others, that reinforces your anxiety. If you had obsessive compulsive disorder and you suddenly had to be told to wash your hands all the time, you can imagine the stress. So it's just to be aware that it will affect people in different ways, but the students you're working with, they have these issues. And as I've said earlier, because they're perfectionistic, many of them as medical students, to get A stars, A stars, A stars, you have to be to a degree. We're selecting for perfectionism, so we are selecting for young people who are more likely to have these conditions. And so that might lead to an interesting discussion, not for me now, about how we select medical students. Then just into my last slide or two, the long-term impact. Okay, we know from previous studies done in the 80s that graduating in a recession is bad for your health. And very sadly, it can lead to a specific rise in mortality. It impacts morbidity, so heart disease, lung cancer, liver disease, and drug misuse. And sadly, also things like they're less likely to be married or more likely to divorce and not have children. So what I suppose I ask on this slide, when we think about how do we support them, you know, graduating in a recession, is how do you recession proof your young people that you're supporting? And there are specific things that you can do. Okay, these are the things that have been shown to be helpful. You can create community. It is the number one thing that connects people and supports them, is to feel part of a community. And that might be identifying with a particular, you know, brand. I say brand as in, you know, the NHS or your GP practice or CUMEC, you know, whatever it is that you pick as a brand. Connect them to that. People feel part of a community, and it really, really helps them. You need to build those social connections. So a brilliant online, you know, fun activity or game or mini quiz that's not too competitive, things like that can help to build that community. Try and look at things like, you know, if there is any COVID related stigma that's going on, if they've been, you know, if they're in an at-risk group that we mentioned before, you know, if they've been bereaved or if they've got any worries about mental health, you know, try and talk about stuff openly. And just, you know, talk, you know, if you work with the Students' Union or you have other peer-to-peer support, connect other people in for their support. That's really important, because, you know, and think about whether you yourself, probably not, but your team need extra training to understand the impact of COVID on young people. So to recession-proof your graduates, what has been shown to help is social connections, careers advice, and money advice. They need hardship funding, but they also need to have financial skills, and often we forget that. So those are the things that you can do that are quite practical, and you might want to provide some resources or support for your students around that. So I just want to thank you all for what you do, because this is how we help young people. And this is my final slide. Young people come to us with all sorts of complex things, but they often only come, sadly, when they reach rock bottom. This young lady came to see me, and when she first came to see me, she looked absolutely dreadful. She was very much sort of thin, underweight, unwashed, long hair, looking lank, and sat down and she said, "Dr. Thompson, I'm thinking of killing myself. I don't know if there's anything you can do, but this is my last resort, really." So we started talking, we started thinking about what we could do to help. We talked about various options, you know, whether it was medication, therapy, and so on. And the weeks passed. She came back each week. We got her started with a therapist. We got her started with medication. As you can imagine, that had to change a few times. We even had to change the therapist. But the weeks and months passed, and eventually she came back in to see me. And I hadn't seen her for a couple of months. She sat down and she said, and she just looked so different. She looked well, she'd filled out a bit, you know, looked just really well. And she said, "Dr. Thompson, I've come to see you because I'm graduating this week, and I wanted to let you know I'm fine, I'm doing really well, but I wanted to show you my new tattoo." And I thought, oh my God, she thinks I know what that is. It's very pretty. And she said it's the chemical symbol for serotonin. And she attributed her recovery to serotonin. Okay. I said, well, that's really interesting. She said, well, I had it done for 2 reasons. One, I had it done because I want to have it on my wrist so that when, not if, but when I feel down again in life, I know that I can get through this. I've done it before and it will remind me that I've done this before. I thought, oh, wow. Okay, that's a really impressive way to remind yourself. And she said, the second thing is I had it done on my 24th birthday, because that was the day I'd planned to kill myself. And actually, I was in recovery and feeling well, and I wanted to mark my recovery. And I thought, what a beautiful thing to do. And I think it's just a wonderful way to remind us all that what we do, what you do, supporting your students matters so much. So thank you. I'll stop there. And, you know, if you've got any other questions or anything, I'm always happy to have emails or contact me on my social media.